As our first National Telework Week draws to a close, I think it is a risk to conclude that telework will naturally expand over the next 8 years and that we will comfortably reach what appears to be a modest 12% goal. We've been talking amongst researchers, amongst the companies that are strong users of telework, and when you're talking to the converted, it is very easy to be misled. Because if you're just talking to people who agree with you, well, you inevitably think, well, that must be everybody. Unfortunately, the real world is that's not the case. There have been many false dawns with telework. Someone recently was talking to me about a telework policy that Bob Carr issued in the mid-1990s. Mark then mentioned to me, well, actually, telework's been talked about since the 1970s. So we've been talking about this for a long time, and yet in Australia, take-up is still around 6%. In the Australian public service, it's around 4%. There must be good reasons why, despite all of us agreeing it's a good idea, it still hasn't taken off. And I think in many ways the research needs to focus on that particular issue. And it's useful to, I think, reflect on the comments of perhaps an archetypal sceptic, Boris Johnson, the Mayor of London, perhaps expressed the scepticism best when he said, and I quote, "Telework is a skiver's paradise. It is just something that bludgers use as an excuse for general malingering. It's a glorified sick note." And if you want more along those lines, just Google Mr. Johnson and telework, and you will find extensive discussion of his views on telework. While not all sceptical managers would express their views in quite the colourful way as Mr. Johnson has, it does highlight the challenge we face. It probably goes to, I think, two very specific issues. Whilst sceptical managers will dress it up in many different ways, why telework's not a good idea, I think it boils down to two things. One, a lack of trust. It's fundamentally about a lack of trust. I don't trust the person I supervise. Secondly, it boils down to the way people manage. And there is still, despite all of the management theories of the last 50 years, a very Dickensian approach to management which says, I need to be sitting just behind you to make sure that you're not skiving off. I might be being unfair, but that's the feeling you get when you talk to someone who's more sceptical about telework. There are many ways we can think about how to deal with this, but one of the best has got to be through high-quality research. To understand why managers have these views and to understand how we can help them overcome their fears. And fundamentally, lack of trust is about fear. To this end, some 6 to 8 Australian public service agencies, following the Prime Minister's announcement earlier this week, will be trialling telework using the NBN, or equivalent broadband connections, during 2013. We, the department, will actually start in April next year. We are in the process of designing our approach to trialling telework using the NBN now, and we hope to start in April. There will be many agencies, much larger than the Department of Broadband, we hope that will also be trialling. A question for these agencies will be to identify the most appropriate methodology for designing and evaluating these trials. A randomised control trial, such as the one conducted by researchers at Stanford University in 2011, is probably an example of a highly robust approach. But unfortunately, that trial, and indeed any robust randomised control trial, would require a sufficiently large number of teleworkers and a control group that can be statistically significant. Hard to find. Secondly, the cohort of teleworkers and control group would need to be undertaking broadly similar work in order for such a trial to be effective. This is suitable for very large organisations. I can imagine the Department of Health Human Services, the Department or the Australian Tax Office would be suitable for such a trial. Unfortunately, for smaller organisations such as ourselves, a different research methodology will be needed. One approach that others have suggested, and indeed I was talking to Yvette about it the other day, is to compare expectations amongst managers, teleworkers, co-workers and clients before the start of the trial, and to compare that to a similar assessment at the end of the trial. Not as good as a randomised controlled trial, but nevertheless a reasonably well accepted approach to testing these issues. In terms of what such research should focus on, I suggest there are perhaps three sets of issues to be considered. Firstly, of course, the trial would need to assess the costs and benefits of telework to the individual organisation, using a set of predetermined KPIs. It'll be important to look at the issue from an employer perspective because that is the group that needs the most convincing. The recent research done by Deloitte Access Economics, and we have John Marnie here who very capably ran that for us, found that it's not potential employees that are reluctant. They're not the ones lacking trust. It's the managers that lack the trust, and so it's from their perspective that perhaps most of the research is needed. And while the cost side of telework may be easier to assess, assessing the benefits from an employer perspective can be more difficult, particularly the case when we're assessing impact on productivity. This may well be where the real challenge for researchers lies. Other benefits, such as impact on staff turnover, increased ability to attract skilled staff, and accommodation savings, would also need to be addressed, but may be somewhat easier to assess. Secondly, the trials that public service departments, Commonwealth public service departments, and we're hopeful state public service departments will also take up the mantle, would need to assess the risks and issues associated with telework and how effectively these were addressed during the trial. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of this is measuring the impact of telework on internal communications and teamwork, as well as on issues such as isolation. We don't have much experience on how communication would operate in an environment where you do have high-speed broadband and the collaboration tools that enables. It'll be interesting to see how those tools get used. Secondly, as I said, the trials will need to look at how the NBN capabilities were used and how they could be used better. Finally, the research is needed on the lessons learned by other organisations that have been using telework for some time. This does seem to be an area of a research gap. For example, at the macro level, we know much about the telework experience of organisations such as Cisco, Microsoft, IBM, KPMG, others. We know little about their day-to-day practices in terms of telework and how they make it really tick. That's going to be a challenge for research in this space. Of particular interest from the Department of Broadband's perspective is how telework is used to deliver effective client or customer service. What we've effectively done, potentially done with telework, is moved the client service officer to their home, and potentially the client may well be in another location, they may well also be at home. How does that change the dynamics? How do you manage under those sorts of circumstances? We also know that Australia's banks and insurance companies are moving down the telework path, but there's little research on their experience. It'll be interesting to understand how the banks manage this. They, of course, have their own culture and own ethos in this space. You can rest assured the banks don't do this just because they want to be nice to their staff. They do it because of bottom line. So they clearly must see a bottom line benefit here. How they're going to deliver that bottom line benefit will be fascinating. So there are many opportunities for researchers in the emergence of telework enabled by high-speed broadband. I congratulate Yvette in particular and Macquarie University for taking the initiative to establish the Anywhere Working Research Network. We in government will be watching your work very closely, and I'm sure we'll have much to learn from your efforts and many opportunities to partner with you. I do wish the network all the very best, and once again, congratulations and thank you.